My name is Steve Bates, and I'm standing in Sporobole, which is now hosting my exhibition Black Seas. Black Seas is the title of a large body of work that I've been working on for the last few years, and that I'll continue to develop for a few more years. And it takes historical and contemporary experiences of auditory hallucination as a starting point to think about ways in which we listen to the world as individuals and as a society. So Black Seas is a body of work that includes video, film, installation, performance, music, radio broadcast, and kind of is influenced by these sort of experiences and the research that's happening in psychiatry and in cognitive science, and also drawing from, as I mentioned earlier, this history of literature and film that also kind of takes auditory hallucination, or hallucination in a broader sense, and uses it to as a sort of influence on the work. So Black Seas is a project that tries to think of auditory hallucination in many ways as both being entirely banal and boring, and as maybe even a beautifully poetic experience, but trying to find a balance between realizing that for some people's experience it can be very stressful and traumatizing, while for others it can be even fun or playful or enjoyable. And just sort of thinking about how, as a society, we might interpret these experiences, and how we treat people who have these experiences is also part of the project. In the West, there's been sort of historically it's been a situation where people who hallucinate sound or vision or smell or touch, there's been a stigma attached to that experience, so people often try to hide it or not share it publicly. And some of the research that's coming out now is realizing that with this sort of attachment of stigma to this experience and people trying to keep it as a private or a secret experience, it leads to a direct influence on how people can hallucinate. In some cultures, hallucination is not viewed as pathological, and that can manifest itself into the types of sound people hear. In some cultures, when people hear voices, they aren't negative, they might be playful or supportive or friendly. It tends to be in the West that people who hear voices, it's extremely negative and stressful. So some of the research is finding out that society can have a direct influence on the type of hallucination that people experience. While I've been here at Sporobole, I've been able to create some new work that's been influenced directly by being in Sherbrooke and the resources available at Sporobole. So this video here is basically sort of a study of the acoustics of the waterfalls in Sherbrooke. And why that's interesting to me in terms of, in relation to the Black Seas project, is people who hallucinate sound. For many people, they describe it as sounding like waterfalls or trees blowing in the wind or radio static. And so there's this sort of broadband sound that people describe their hallucination as either sounding like, or that when they're in those places that it's led to hallucination. So this project is sort of trying to consider being in Sherbrooke for the month and sort of seeing in this location what could be sounds that people could associate with hallucination as well. The soundtrack is created actually with radio static. It's not the sound of the waterfalls, actually. It was created with me recording radio static and then more tonal elements. And then in the gallery space, I played it back and re-recorded it 5 or 6 times, each time playing with the EQ. to sort of create this this sort of ambient soundtrack that could be related to the waterfalls, but also specifically using radio, because radio has a strong history with auditory hallucination as well. Sometimes people describe their hallucinations as sounding like a radio playing in another room, as a very sort of common description of auditory hallucination for people. So that's one work that was made here. The second work was created for the outdoor 16-channel sound system here. Of All the Hearers is a new piece that takes a letter submitted by a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who lived in Boston in 1891 and wrote a report or a letter to the Journal for the Society for Psychical Research. The interesting thing for me in the research that I've been doing is it's one of the few examples of a group of people hearing something that didn't exist. There was no music playing in the room or in the building that they were in, or even outside on the street. And these are all sort of details that Sarah Jenkins outlines in her letter. So it's this kind of group psychic experience that people describe in detail about how the sound moves around the room, but also they describe it as a type of music that they had never heard before, that it wasn't comparable for them to any other style of music. So in the piece I've had two people perform the characters in the story. One of them is Sarah Jenkins, who's the woman who wrote the letter, and then I had a friend translate the text into French. So there's an English and a French version that happens across the 16 channels of audio outside the building. And then the text is on the wall here in the gallery space. Hallucination Journal, February 13th to 17th, a cappella version, is here performed by Elizabeth Anka Vijagic. It's based on a story that happened in also the late 1800s with a doctor in New York City, Dr. Rusa, who was studying various hearing disorders. And he had a patient, a female patient, who hallucinated musical notes. And so as a way to see if there is any pattern to the notes that she would hear, he asked her to keep a diary of the notes. And so the next time she came back to visit him, she gave him this journal, sort of a hallucination diary, I guess is a way to think of it. So she would say, you know, February 13th, morning, C sharp, D, E, whatever the notes are. And then in the evening, so she'd go through a number of days where she would write down all these different notes that she would hear. So I've taken that as a way to treat that diary as a sort of musical score, and there's various versions of myself and other collaborators performing that as if it was a piece of music. So in this version, a cappella, Elizabeth has memorized the notes and has done 3 takes of performing the notes in sequence. And I suppose for me it's a piece where there's sort of a haunting or a ghost-like idea behind it, I guess, where this experience of the past is coming back to be reenacted in the future. And I suppose it's sort of a tribute or an homage to the patient's musical aureum or tinnitus. So she had musical tinnitus. So that's the story behind that piece. And one of the things for me that's interesting about this project is to start thinking of a few things in terms of how we think about people's experience and how people relate to each other and how we treat each other. And for me, that's become a really strong part of the project, because it's really made me realize that I could be standing with someone and their experience is so radically different than mine, and I would have no awareness of what their real experience was. And I know that there's traditions of that in philosophical thought, but I guess the idea that I'm thinking about with this project is just the sort of visceral experience of not knowing someone else's experience. And I think that has really profound implications on how we treat each other and political systems that we devise and cultural systems that we live through. So for me, that's one of the threads that's really starting to come out in the project. And then, of course, there's much thinking of sort of more broader ideas of all of our sensorial experience is quite unique, and getting at this idea that there's sort of a group or social hallucination that's just a system that we develop that we all agree to live by. So for me as a Canadian, I'm living under the system of capitalism, which is a made-up system that has all kinds of influence, both conscious and subconscious, that some people describe as a sort of a group hallucination, that we're all living as if this was this sort of natural system that we're just under the influence of, rather than the system that we've made. So through hallucination, I'm starting to think about sort of more ideas of agency in a more political systems as well. So that's kind of was an unexpected area of research for me that I feel like I'm now kind of moving towards developing further with the project. So it's been incredibly rewarding for me to have this month to work at Sporobole, to develop some new ideas and to see what the work would sort of feel like and how it would sit in a gallery space. We also did a performance with an ensemble of 5 musicians and a video artist that was really integral to me developing this work here. And the plan for the next year or so is to really take the performance elements on tour throughout the world, as many places I can go. One of the things that they're discovering in the research that they're doing around hallucination is that it's really all cultures of the world, all social, political, economic classes, all races hallucinate, it seems, somewhat equally. There's not a group of people who hallucinate more or less. And so for me, it's really important that this project doesn't live just sort of in Canada or in a European context, that it really, through the work, I can really travel to as many places in the world as possible to kind of keep thinking about ways that this experience of auditory hallucination impacts people.